There's one thing that's still nagging at me with regard to the matter of the Whoopi Goldberg incident, and I want to mention it right at the top so it doesn't have to sit in my brain anymore. And after that, I will try to find an elegant way to pivot to the Queen of England, who is the actual subject of tonight's episode. Now, with all the bloviating that's been done about the matter of Whoopi's suspension, you know what I haven't heard mentioned by anyone? I haven't heard mentioned the matter of cultural appropriation. And how so often it turns into such a selective, cynical, self-serving, pernicious thing. When she was an up-and-coming actress named Karen Johnson and she needed a wacky stage name, she chose Goldberg. And nobody accused her of cultural appropriation or of mocking the Jewish people, even though she quite obviously was poking a bit of fun. And she's still walking around with that wacky stage name 40 years later, 40 plus years later, and even in the woke 21st century, even when she is actively embroiled in an anti-Semitism scandal still. Nobody has ever accused her of being a cultural appropriator for walking around with a Jewish surname, not even Ben Shapiro. Imagine that. Meanwhile, there's a young actress and comedian who calls herself Aquafina. I'm not sure why you would stage name yourself after a brand of bottled water, but you do you, girlfriend. She was just in the Shang-Chi movie, in which she played strong female character who's a better hero than the male title character number 2, who has all the same attributes as strong female character who's a better hero than the male title character number 1, except she's zany and quippy, and has the male title character stumbling around lost in the ninth circle of friend zone hell. But this girl, the actress, let's just call her Bottled Water Girl, because that sounds better than the thing she actually calls herself. Bottled Water Girl is, I assume she's of Chinese extraction. No, they do not all look the same anyway. That's a terrible thing to say, Jim Eagle. But she found herself one of the latest targets of the woke rage mob, because apparently she made a habit in the past of speaking in an affected black accent in the context of her comedy routines. I'm not going to speak in a fake black accent right now, not because I care about offending anybody, but because I'm planning on doing another accent later in the video, and I'm simply not a good enough performer to carry off multiple accents in one episode and to do it credibly. But Bottled Water Girl, I guess she got really freaked out when the woke rage mob descended and decided that she's the next one to be canceled for doing comedy routines in which she speaks a dialect of English that is not her native dialect, and what a shocking crime that is. To the point where she self-banhammered her entire Twitter account. And when young people remove themselves from social media, that's how you know shit is serious. That's probably when you should start the suicide watch, when that happens. So here's the question. If cultural appropriation is always bad, always unacceptable, even in a comedy context, then why in all these 40 plus years have there never been any calls for Karen Johnson to renounce the comedic use of a Jewish surname? And if a non-black person using a fake black accent is some sort of unforgivable crime, shouldn't Eminem be in the penitentiary? Shouldn't we start pulling down the statues of Elvis Presley? Should white folks stop listening to jazz and blues? Should white musicians stop playing it? Because where does this road end once you start going down it? If people of different ethnic extractions can't enjoy and participate in one another's art, irrespective of their talent, irrespective of how well they do it, then doesn't everybody lose? And haven't we defeated the entire purpose of building a pluralistic society that's animated by enlightened Western values? Now, this is not a new argument, not by any means. It's actually been going on for far longer than any of us has been alive. The best example I can think of for the exact dichotomy I'm talking about would be the respective approaches and views that were taken by Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf regarding whom they would allow to play in their respective bands. Howlin' Wolf never had a white guy in his touring band, ever. Wouldn't even contemplate it. He would get salty if you even asked him about it. As far as he was concerned, this is black music. It arises out of the black experience, and consequently only black people can understand it and play it correctly. And there's no evidence that he ever reconsidered that attitude. Even though by the end of his life in 1976, the all-black audiences he had been playing to 25 years before, they were mostly all white now. And on the whole other side of that continuum of thought sits Muddy Waters, who didn't care in the slightest what somebody looked like. if they could make his music sound the way he liked it to sound. So he always had white guys in his band for at least the last 15 years of his career, all the way from around 68 to 83. Bob Margolin on guitar, Jerry Portnoy on harp, two of the whitest peckerwoods who ever woodpecked. But listen to that band in 1977 with Willie Big Eye Smith on drums, Pinetop Perkins on piano, and you were listening to a sound being played by a multiracial, multi-generational group of players that is as good as electric blues can get. It is the pinnacle of the art form. And as far as I'm concerned, an open-minded attitude on matters of race helped to make it that way. And would you look here, I have used up the whole opening segment, and now I don't have to think of an elegant transition to the main topic, and I love it when a non-existent plan comes together. Don't you, Jim Eagle? From atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where if you should find yourself stranded outdoors for the night, one of Stacey Abrams' bra cups will always suffice as an improvised shelter. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the unintended Tuesday edition of the program. Had a bit of a technical snafu last night. It was late. I didn't feel like taking the whole thing over again, and so here we are. I am your eponymous host and humble servant, and tonight, on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of the proclamation of her reign, which actually took place yesterday, the anniversary, I mean, we pay tribute, but not homage, to Her Britannic Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Now, you remember last July when the Duke of Edinburgh had passed away and the Queen sat alone by herself at her husband's funeral with a ridiculous mask on her face, lest the image be created that she was not abiding by the same restrictions and living with the same privations as her people had to. And let's contrast that example with the example of the current Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, the man whose hair is the answer to the immortal trivia question, what happens when mother gets drunk and busts out the Flowbee? Boris thought it would be a smashing idea to have a series of maskless, non-social distanced booze-ups at number 10 Downing Street, back during the bleakest days of the pandemic and the lockdowns. How he thought he could keep a secret from everyone, I have no idea, but of course he couldn't. People talked, pictures got out, and now his premiership, in all likelihood, is as doomed as Neville Chamberlain's was at the start of May 1940. But consider those two examples, and then consider the question: how does the head of the one institution survive for 7 decades while only gaining and increasing in public affection and esteem, while the head of the other institution, the institution that wields the real political power, it has leaders who regularly destroy themselves over stupid things within a matter of 2 or 3 or 4 years sometimes, and who wind up reviled by the people of the country? I think those two examples provide the answer to the question. The monarch, who is not directly answerable to the people, cares more about doing right by them than their elected representatives do. And try to imagine, just try to contemplate having the same job for 70 years. Not just the same job, but a job where practically your every utterance is recorded for posterity, and you are filmed and photographed by the world press each and every time you step out the front door of your residence. And it almost doesn't do it justice merely to say, it's been 70 years, or it's been since 1952. It's more instructive to dig down a bit deeper, I think, and talk about the contrast between the world as it was then and the world as it is now. On 7 February 1952, when the Queen officially ascended the throne, the world population stood at 2.6 billion. Since then, it has more than tripled to 7.9 billion. 2 weeks after she came to the throne on 20 February, NATO expanded its membership for the first time, adding Greece and Turkey to the roster, neither of which is anywhere near the North Atlantic, but at least they have remained consistent on that point since then. Winston Churchill was the Queen's first Prime Minister, who was in his second premiership by that point. He's nearly 80 years old by then, not in particularly great shape, but still better than Joe Biden, which probably isn't saying much, but Winston still knew bad policy when he saw it. So it was on that same day, 20 February 1952, almost 7 years after the war had ended, that the UK finally scrapped the compulsory national ID card program they had had in place since the beginning of hostilities back in September of 39. But that wasn't the biggest news of the week from the Prime Minister's office, for on 26 February, Churchill made the announcement that the UK was now in possession of its own atomic bomb, which made at that point a grand total of 3 nuclear weapon states in the world, with the Soviets, of course, having parlayed the intelligence they stole from us into a working device 3 years earlier in 1949. On 20 March, the United States and Japan conclude the peace treaty that officially ends the state of war that began on 7 December 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor. On 22 March, Wernher von Braun publishes the first of his articles on the future of human spaceflight, which will wind up becoming a reality within less than a decade, and within less than 2 decades, Americans will be walking on the surface of the moon. On 29 March, President Harry Truman announces his decision not to seek re-election with the famous words, borrowed from General William Tecumseh Sherman and later re-borrowed by President Lyndon Johnson, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." On 7 April, an episode of I Love Lucy becomes the first television program in world history to attract 10 million viewers. On 15 April, the B-52 Stratofortress flies for the very first time, and after a 70-year service life, much like the Queen herself, it has no intention of retiring. On 15 June, the Diary of Anne Frank is published for the first time in the English language. On 19 June, the U.S. Army Special Forces are created. On 3 July, and this is a good one, the passenger liner SS United States completes its first Atlantic crossing. In other words, the Queen ascended the throne so long ago that they were still building and launching brand new transatlantic passenger steamers. Chew on that. On 23 July, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands established the European Coal and Steel Community, as it was known then, which will one day grow into the many-tentacled evil monster we now know as the European Union. On 23 August, Kitty Wells becomes the first female artist with a #1 hit on the country charts, with her recording of "It Wasn't God Who Made Honky Tonk Angels." On 6 September, television comes to the Great White North as the CBC first begins broadcasting in Montreal and Toronto. On 19 September, the U.S. government bans Charlie Chaplin from re-entering the country, not because he enjoys fornicating with teenage girls, but because he might be a communist. On 8 October, ceasefire negotiations break down and the shooting begins anew on the Korean Peninsula, where it will continue unabated for about another year and a half. On 1 November, the United States of America detonates the world's first thermonuclear device, codenamed Shot Mike, which produces an estimated yield of 10.4 megatons of TNT. On 4 December, General Dwight Eisenhower defeats Adlai Stevenson, as he will again 4 years later, to be elected President of the United States. On that same day, 4 November, in a decidedly more odious development, the National Security Agency is founded. On 20 November, the world's first sex change operation is performed, so never let it be said that I don't include content for the wokesters. But just imagine that. Imagine your current job or your most recent job and try to envisage having had that same job since they were still launching passenger steamers and no Canadian had ever watched television. And since I promised to do an accent tonight, and since I'm a man of my word, and since I have a soft spot for such things, I want to read out the Queen's Accession proclamation that was delivered by the Garter King of Arms, Sir George Bellew, at St. James's Palace on 7 February 1952. Whereas it has pleased Almighty God to call to his mercy our late sovereign Lord King George VI of blessed and glorious memory, by whose decease the crown is solely and rightfully come to the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, we therefore, the Lords spiritual and temporal of this realm, being here assisted with these his late Majesty's Privy Council, with representatives of other members of the Commonwealth, with other principal gentlemen of quality, with the Lord Mayor, Aldermen, and citizens of London, do hereby with one voice and consent of tongue and heart publish and proclaim that the high and mighty Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Mary is now, by the death of our late sovereign lord of happy memory, become Queen Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of this realm and of her other realms and territories beyond the seas, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, to whom her lieges do acknowledge all faith and constant obedience, with hearty and humble affection, beseeching God, by whom kings and queens do reign, to bless the royal Princess Elizabeth II with long and happy years, to reign over us, given at St. James's Palace this 6th day of February in the year of our Lord 1952. God save the Queen. I think it's fair to say after 70 years that God has indeed saved the Queen, but I'm not sure whether he can save the British monarchy or really any of the other European monarchies in general. 100 years hence, I think I would be very surprised to see any monarchies surviving outside the Islamic world, frankly. And irrespective of how unimpressive the guy is who's going to be the next king, and make no mistake, he is unimpressive. I think the more important question is, will the British people be able to adjust? Will they be inclined to adjust to having a king instead of a queen after having had a queen for so long? And not just this queen, because the British monarchy has taken on something of a decidedly feminine character these past couple centuries as a consequence of the fact that for 134 out of the last 184 years, the British sovereign has been either Queen Victoria or Queen Elizabeth. So all the way from 1837 to the present day, it's just the period between 1901 and 1952 when you had any kings. Apart from that, the next king who ascends the throne, he's going to be already pretty far into his dotage. If he became the sovereign right now today, the Prince of Wales would be the second oldest king in British history, surpassed only by George III, who died in his 82nd year. And it's not remotely out of the realm of possibility that the Queen might survive another 6 or 7 years and live to the same age her mother did, so it may come to pass that when King Chuck the Woke comes to the throne, he will already be, on the first day of his reign, the oldest king in history. And what are you supposed to do with that? Do you throw him a big fancy coronation when he might die of old age before the ceremony ends? On the question of his regnal name, by the way, I don't think he'll choose Charles III, as much as I would like to be able to refer to him as King Chuck the Woke, which I probably will just do anyway, let's be honest, but I think it's much more likely that he'll honor his grandfather and his great-grandfather by reigning as King George VII. I heard the Queen's address yesterday, and I was pleased to hear that she's attempting to put to rest this nonsense about the current Duchess of Cornwall not being called Queen Camilla when she's married to the king, because when you're married to the king, you're the queen, and that's all there is to it. The title is yours by right, and I've actually heard some American commentators who clearly don't have the faintest idea what they're talking about, suggesting that to call Camilla Princess Consort would be no different than her current practice of calling herself Duchess of Cornwall instead of Princess of Wales, but those things are not the same. When she calls herself Duchess of Cornwall today, she's using one of her own subsidiary titles, which anybody in the nobility has the right to do, should they so choose. But if her husband ascends the throne as king and you call his wife Princess Consort, that's a made-up title that somebody pulled out their ass that doesn't mean anything. It's completely absurd. And who would they even be doing it for? People who are still obsessed with Diana when she's been in the ground for 25 years? The same people who authored that embarrassing, mawkish display of mass public blubbering that accompanied her death, and by which the British people forfeited for all time the reputation of a people who maintain a stiff upper lip and don't go in for ridiculous public displays of performative emotion. In fact, I think I'll go one better than I did earlier. I wouldn't be surprised in the least if all of the European monarchies are swept away within the next 50 years, and that means the UK, Spain, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, the constitutional monarchies. In other words, there are a few places in Europe where the monarch still wields some nominal political power, but really only in the micro-states, Luxembourg, Monaco, Liechtenstein, Andorra. If you want to include the Vatican, you can include the Vatican. They can probably survive a bit longer, but the bigger ones, the monarchies that just exist as tourist attractions and vessels of history and tradition, I don't think there's going to be any saving them, and that's too bad. Because is there anything so wrong about an institution that exists to offer people in the present day a connection with their nation's past? When you've been a liberal democracy from the outset, as our country has, I think there is something you lose, culturally speaking, when you have no institutions of that type. And I've always kind of agreed with John Adams on that point, though his critics still just want to call him a monarchist, which is wildly unfair because he was not that. If John Adams has no revolutionary credentials, who the hell does? His point was that people shouldn't be so quick to reject all the pomp and the pageantry that accompanies royalty and nobility, because that stuff can serve a useful purpose in unifying the people of a nation. So why not just keep a few of the trappings without having the actual monarchy? And these questions may be more important than they sound, since there currently is a struggle taking place for cultural supremacy, and the people who are winning it would like nothing more than for all history and all traditions to be tossed into the dustbin of history. And people like that cannot be allowed to win, because then you wind up right back in the French Revolution in 1789 or the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, when the desire to sweep away the institutions of the past results in the streets flowing red with the blood of the innocent. And that's probably not a very uplifting note on which to end, but that's the end. Congratulations to Her Majesty on 70 years of a job. Very well done. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you tomorrow. So have a pleasant day. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.